centuries-old holy tome, unraveling riddles from ruins, a super sleuth in a skull cap.
I'm going on an adventure. So there's only one way to figure it all out. Unzip the archaeology. Make it naked.
Today on The Naked Archaeologist, a brilliant but brutal leader dies a vile and mysterious death. What really killed King Herod? But first, the most frequently quoted historian of Christ's time paints a vivid picture of ancient Rome. But is that picture accurate?
All the stories we know about Jesus and his time come to us from the Gospels. Jesus healing the lepers, the miracle of loaves and fish, his Last Supper, and his miraculous resurrection. But all of these stories come to us from writers with a religious agenda. Is there any evidence outside the Gospels that confirms that Jesus actually existed?
Only one. In the writings of a first-century historian named Flavius Josephus. And here's what he wrote.
About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if one ought to call him a man. He was the Messiah.
Surprisingly, this is the only reference of Jesus outside the New Testament. But the question is, can we trust the reference and its author?
Josephus is arguably the most important historian to Western civilization. Everything we know about the first-century Jewish war with Rome, the archaeology of Second Temple Jerusalem, and the world in which Jesus lived and taught depends entirely on the prolific writings of Josephus. And yet, he's also reputed to be a liar and a braggart, a traitor to his own people who would say or do anything to stay alive. Begging the question, what, if anything, that Josephus wrote can we now trust as history? Can archaeology help us answer that question? I'm traveling to Israel to get a closer look at the places Josephus wrote about. But first, I need to know more about the man. First off, a chat with archaeologist Gabi Barkai to find out this. Who was the real Josephus?
He was born somewhere here, in the place where we sit right now, in the upper city of Jerusalem. This was the area of the Jerusalemite aristocracy. He was born here, was from a priestly family. He, as a youth, worked in the temple of Jerusalem as a priest. Later on, he was among those who planned the defense of Jerusalem against the Romans.
He was a revolutionary.
Yes, yes.
Josephus was from a priestly family. At the age of 29, he was appointed commander of Galilee by the Jewish revolutionary government. But he was a reluctant fighter. He believed opposition to Rome was national suicide. When the Romans unleashed the full strength of their military, he found himself surrounded just outside what is modern-day Yodefat. I traveled to the Galilee to get a sense of the place where Josephus and his revolutionary army were holed up. Imagine this. Josephus is hiding out in a cave like this one with a group of religious zealots who are determined to resist the Romans to the bitter end. Josephus knows that resistance is useless, but he needs to find a way to stay alive. So he convinces his comrades to kill themselves.
Josephus? Oh, Babu. Okay, Khan.
So suddenly, Josephus was left with the last of the defenders. They hid out in caves. The Romans were everywhere. They had a choice: surrender to the Romans or kill themselves. 10 people were chosen by lot to kill. As it turns out, the last lot was cast and it fell to him. And guess what? He didn't kill himself. He surrendered. But in order to survive the cave, Josephus would have had to be a mathematical genius, or at least a really good chess player. And as one of the only survivors of the cave suicides, Josephus was also the only person to document the event, raising suspicions of the accuracy of his story. I discussed this with Annette Yoshiko Reed who specializes in all things Josephus.
You know, was that divine intervention, or was he very good at cards? How did he manage to be the last guy?
I don't know. It's not clear from the account. The account leaves open, first of all, that he was just buying time. I mean, it is possible that he came up with the idea because as people would actually kill themselves, he'd have more chance of persuading them, which is what he was trying to do in the first place.
It's one way to win an election.
Exactly, just to narrow the vote. There's a rather compelling speech that he makes there. So maybe he was trying to buy himself time. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which he says, is that he does seem to think that the hand of God is somehow involved in him being saved from the cave and from the war in general. So it is arguable that he did think of himself as having some divine role. And then the other possibility is he just did some math.
When Josephus was captured by the Roman general Vespasian, he played his best-handed poker ever. He told Vespasian that he had had a vision and predicted that Vespasian would become the next emperor of Rome. Not immune to flattery, Vespasian took Josephus under his wing, sparing his life. Sure enough, Vespasian did become the next emperor and then commissioned Josephus to write a history of the Jewish revolt. Josephus moved to Rome and was branded a traitor, accused of living in the lap of luxury while his fellow Jews continued to suffer under Roman rule. But why would a Roman emperor let a Jewish rebel write the history of the Roman victory over Judea?
The thing about Vespasian is Vespasian and his son Titus actually didn't have very many military triumphs, so it was very important to them to stress the capture of Judea.
Josephus would want to say that the Jews weren't nobodies. This was an important war. And in a weird way, it would be in the interest of the conquering emperor to say the same thing, because if they're nobodies, what's the big deal of winning a nothing war?
Yes, yes.
But if Josephus didn't mind exaggerating about his own life, then how can we trust his reference to Jesus, the only reference outside the Gospels? There's only one way to find out. Strip his history naked and compare it to the archaeology. The first-century historian Flavius Josephus wrote in great detail about Jerusalem during Jesus' time. But because so much of what he wrote about himself appears to be exaggerated, can we trust him? Josephus knew how to spin a great yarn. For example, in his autobiography, he tells the story of how earlier in life he survived a shipwreck in the middle of the Mediterranean and then swam all night to the shores of what is now Italy. Josephus's writing style is full of dramatic flourishes and what appears to be exaggeration. I asked Steve Mason, who has studied Josephus for years, if Josephus is believable as a historian.
Is Josephus writing drama or history?
Even the best historical writers have a great deal of drama in their history. All of these people are trained in rhetoric, and rhetoric is the art of compelling people to listen to you, telling a good story, making them believe you. So there are set ways of doing that, and Josephus does them all. There's lots of drama. One thing you do is when you are writing a narrative, you can't be boring. You can't just tell one story continuously. You must break it up, change the scene, change who's involved in the thing, change the location, jump around a little bit, say, meanwhile, over in Rome, this was happening. Or just come to a climax.
So he's good at all of that.
He's very good at it. He gets to a climax in his story. He says, now, let me pause right there.
He would have been a screenwriter today.
Exactly.
I asked archaeologist Gabi Barkay, can we trust him? Should he be vilified as a liar or praised as a historian?
So, Josephus, is he a disgusting traitor, a brilliant historian, self-promoter?
We should thank him. We should thank him because as an archaeologist, I can tell you that digging in Jerusalem, digging in Caesarea Philippi, in Herodium, in Masada, and various other spots, they come out very much fitting the picture.
The archaeology fits this
archaeology fits perfectly the descriptions of Josephus. Josephus is a reliable source, but any historical source should be taken by scholars critically.
In fact, when you review Josephus's writings critically, you can't help but notice the accuracy of his broader strokes. His writings have been used to uncover major archaeological sites, such as the one at Caesarea, a harbor that Josephus describes and archaeologists have confirmed as built in 21 BC at the whim of Herod the Great. Now a popular site for rock concerts, Caesarea was an entirely man-made port. Josephus's descriptions have also helped archaeologists reconstruct Jerusalem as it was before the Romans destroyed it. I met up with Professor Isaiah Gaffney, who took me on a walking tour of a miniature version of ancient Jerusalem.
That's not what I expected.
Yes, this is a model of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period.
This looks accurate.
It is.
How did they figure out all of this?
Well, we have the well-known Jewish historian Josephus, who describes Jerusalem with great detail. And the details here are based on Josephus.
Physically is accurate?
Yes. In other words, we've done a lot of excavation in Jerusalem. And by and large, almost everything that Josephus describes physically, we can find, we can locate here. And it's built to scale, 1 to 50. The topography is exact as well. In other words, the higher spots, lower spots. Here you have the northern part of the city with the wall, southern part of the city, the Temple Mount, and the western gates of Jerusalem. And so the model really makes sense, and it all does come together.
Whether Josephus knew it or not, his writings have fueled more than a few myths throughout the centuries. One myth in particular ended up being one of the greatest archaeological finds of the end of the 20th century. A fortress in the desert called Masada. But did he get it right?
Coming up, quarrying facts from ancient ruins.
Josephus writes that Masada was built of white marble. Not even one piece of white marble was found.
One of the greatest stories that Josephus ever spun was the history of Masada. Once thought to be nothing but a myth or a figment of his imagination, Masada now stands as arguably one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time. But how much of what Josephus wrote can be verified by the archaeology? I traveled to Masada to find out. From Josephus's writings, we know that Masada was a fortress where Jewish rebels led by Eliezer ben Yair held off the 10th Legion of the Roman army for almost 6 years. According to Josephus, when the Romans finally breached Masada's gates, they discovered that the rebels were dead. They had committed mass suicide. This sounds remarkably similar to Josephus's account of Yodefat, where rebels chose death over surrender. And just like Yodefat, where Josephus made a speech convincing his followers to use lots to determine the order of death, Commander Ben Yair made a similar speech urging the same thing. Ben Yair, however, went through with the suicide. As we look at the history of the 1st century, we find no surviving records, whether Roman or Jewish, that support the accounts of the Christian Bible or the existence of Jesus, except for one, the writings of Josephus. In 2 passages, Josephus seems to be referring to Jesus of Nazareth. I met with Professor Steve Mason to find out what exactly Josephus had to say about Jesus.
Does he mention Jesus? That's a bit of a controversy.
He mentions some 21 guys, I think, named Jesus. And one of those he mentions is Jesus of Nazareth. He talks about Jesus in 2 places. The most certain one is not when he's talking about Jesus actually. He's talking about his brother James. And he says that he was executed as a lawbreaker and troublemaker. And he says he was the brother of the so-called Christos, the so-called Christ, Jesus.
But if Josephus calls Jesus a so-called Messiah in one instance, in the second instance he seems to have no doubts. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds. He was a teacher of such people who accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah. But as Steve Mason tells me, this passage is controversial.
he almost certainly didn't write that passage. Why? Because he wrote 30 volumes, and he's always talking about how great Judaism is. He never elsewhere mentions a Messiah. He never mentions the need for a Messiah. He doesn't like messianic figures. He does mention a number of people who were kind of quasi-messiahs who attracted large followings. He really, really doesn't like these people, sees them as troublemakers and kind of demagogues, people who could, you know, persuade a large mass of ignorant people to follow them. So he just doesn't like that kind of person. So for him to say of this man out of the blue, oh, by the way, he was the Messiah, it makes absolutely no sense.
I'm confused. If Josephus didn't write it, who did? Annette Yoshiko Reed says it's the work of Christian scribes added years later.
That seems to be a later addition. It's actually pretty clear that it is a later addition. That's important in a different way. It's important because if it weren't for that aspect, we probably wouldn't have the works of Josephus today, because that was one of the things that spurred the Christian transmission of these works over the centuries.
Meaning the scribe who added that line in probably saved Josephus because he made him more important to Christian theology.
Yes, I think so.
So here's the irony. The fact that Josephus mentioned Jesus caused his words to be preserved by the church. Had they not altered his writings, Josephus's works would probably have been lost.
So let me get this straight. Josephus is a scoundrel, but we should be happy that he was a scoundrel because he probably saved all this history for us. And whoever tinkered with Josephus was a faker, but we should be happy with him because he probably saved Josephus for us.
Yeah, in one sense, yeah.
Josephus turns out to be an incredibly complex character. For years, scholars thought he was nothing more than a myth maker, inventing stories and exaggerating to boost his own importance. But it turns out he was an incredibly accurate historian.
His descriptions of first-century Israel, from Masada to Caesarea, to his descriptions of the actual layout of Jerusalem, turn out to be incredibly precise. Some thought he was a bit of a scoundrel, someone who ingratiated himself to the Romans to save his own skin. But could it be that he was actually a hero? Josephus compares himself to the defenders of Masada and points out that had he too fallen on his own sword, Masada would have been forgotten. And while the description of Jesus as the Messiah attributed to Josephus seems to be a forgery, the fact is that his writings, and his writings alone, are still the only validation of Jesus as a historical figure.
Coming up, the mystique behind the physique of a first-century king.
Young Herod, from a physical point of view, was very robust. He was a warrior, he was an athlete.
The Great casts one of the darkest shadows of the
Seemed as though it was going to be a fatal illness, but he recovered, and after that, again, no mention of any problems physically until just at the time of shortly before his death.
Herod must have been healthy and strong for most of his life, because he survived assassination attempts, poison plots, even a shipwreck. You'd think that after all that, a king could at least come home, put on slippers, and relax on his throne.
Take it easy, dear. Relax.
Oh, these little women have a way, but maybe
Nope.
I forgot to
His
say.
domestic life alone would have done many a man in. The poor guy had to juggle 10 wives, eunuchs, spies, poison plots. The king's life was so complicated, you'd never keep track of it all. Unless you're Canadian Grandmaster of all things Herodian.
Quick, Ron. Yes. I need info on Herod.
Then Herod hears the rumor that 3 of his eunuchs have taken bribes from his son Alexander to usurp the throne. Herod gets suspicion, sends out spies. Soon everybody's denouncing everybody else. It doesn't matter if you're guilty. It doesn't matter if you're innocent. Everybody gets tortured equally. The Romans are marching around with armies all over the place. Antony and Cleopatra are doing their thing in Egypt. Julius Caesar is doing his thing. There's Pompey running around. Wait a minute, Pompey's already dead.
Okay, now that that's all clear, look, don't try to keep it straight. The point is to get a glimpse of the pressure surrounding Herod. Our best clues to Herod's state of mind come from the archaeology. Some people say manic building has Freudian undertones, psyche carved into stone. What do Herod's buildings tell us about the pressures he faced, caught between his Roman neighbors and his Jewish subjects? This is a 1:50 scale model of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus and Herod the Great. Even the Romans recognized that Herod had built Jerusalem into one of the most beautiful cities of the ancient world.
The Romans talk about Jerusalem as being the most famous city of all of the East and not only of Judea. Beginning with Herod's time, Jerusalem was a beautiful city and certainly well known to the Romans of the day.
Herod built a Roman theater in Jerusalem, and this is one of many elements that really changed the nature of the city. It became much more of a Hellenistic Roman city, even though the Temple Mount clearly stressed the Jewish aspect of the city. And so what you have here really is a hybrid. On the one hand, he's a Jew, and there's no question about his legitimate claim to being a Jew. But on the other hand, he's very Hellenized. He's really part of the Greek and Roman world. The palace with two wings to it over here, one named after the Roman emperor, the other after the commander of the Roman armies.
He was naming the palace after the Roman emperor?
After Augustus, the Roman Caesar.
He was sucking up to them.
Well, you might call it that. He was on very good relationship.
Is that historically true?
Yes. He had a very good relationship, a very good working relationship with the Roman emperors. And they got what they wanted out of Herod, which is basically law and order, maybe in reverse sequence. In other words, they needed really order more than anything else. Herod could supply that.
Roman lackey or a master of realpolitik? Either way, Herod's political success gave him the stability to pursue his passion for building.
I would say if you were writing an architectural history of the 1st century BC, Herod would be right at the top of the list in terms of his creativeness, his innovation, his brilliance.
Brilliant in life, brilliant in death, as I'm about to uncover at the Herod family tomb.
Coming up.
So do you want to see a picture of the gangrene? You have a picture of the gangrene, do you? Oh. Herod had such a reputation for being a fantastic builder that when anything from the 1st century that's beautiful is found, everybody says it must be Herod. And when this tomb was found in the late 1800s, it was so beautiful that everybody suddenly said it must be the Herod family tomb. You can see embedded in the rock here a rolling stone, as described in the Gospels from the 1st century, which would block the way to this amazing tomb with this giant courtyard over here. So, we don't know. Maybe it is the Herod family tomb, maybe it isn't. What we do know is if he liked you, he treated you good even after death. If he didn't like you, or if you really got him angry, he made sure that death came sooner rather than later. And that's what happened with his beloved wife. He killed her. And that's what happened with 3 of his sons. He killed them too.
There's a well-known story that Herod at one time killed his sons, whom he suspected of plotting against him, to which the Roman Emperor Augustus said, better to be the pig of Herod than the son of Herod. This, by the way, is a play on Greek words. The word for pig in Greek is hios, and for son is hios. In other words, better to be his hios than his hios. And so a Jew would never slaughter a pig, for obvious reasons, but he might slaughter his sons. In this case, Herod slaughtering his son.
Did you come to any conclusions about whether Herod was nasty to begin with, or whether he was actually a normal guy until his scrotum started falling off?
He seemed to be more cruel and more paranoid than he had been throughout his life at the time of his illness. I think sometimes the suffering that they have undergo during their illness does create problems in the way in which they manage to deal with other people.
Nearing 70 years of age, Herod was struck down by an illness that racked his body with pain and a fierce itching. If he wasn't mad before, this would have done the trick. Josephus records that worms were living in his privates. This would have been the result of advanced gangrene in his privates.
Do you want to see a picture of the gangrene?
You have a picture of the gangrene, do you? We're talking about penis gangrene here. Ooh, I didn't quite. All right.
Gangrene in his willy wasn't the only time a member caused Herod trouble. Family members weren't just family. Marriages were political alliances. Home life was a grand political game, a game that had rules particular to Judea.
When members of the Herodian family have to marry, let's say daughters, have to marry foreign princes, those foreign princes are forced to circumcise themselves. And if they don't, the marriage is canceled.
Did they have to convert to Judaism?
Well, you know, it's a sort of conversion. In other words, it would be unthinkable for a daughter of the Herodian court to marry a prince who was not circumcised. And he required this. So this is the Jewish side to Herod.
He had a Jewish side?
Yes.
At the wedding, did he force them to eat gefilte fish?
I was not there.
It's possible.
Yes. Can I go home?
You want to go? You don't like this line of thing? Wait, we need to get...
Fretting over family foreskin wasn't his only pressure. Trouble with his neighbors cost a few sleepless nights as well. His Roman neighbors included Brutus, Augustus, Mark Antony, and to the south, his sworn enemy, Cleopatra. Dr. Gabby Barkay is a Jerusalem archaeologist familiar with the web of plot and intrigue spun around Herod by Cleopatra.
She hated the guts of Herod, and after every night of a love affair with her favorite Roman rulers, she got as a present.
She was hot, right? Cleopatra was very hot, according to history, right?
Yeah, I prefer Liz Taylor. In any case...
and after every night with her Roman lovers...
She got the income of the plantations of Jericho. Herod was afraid that all his kingdom will be given as a love present to this lady.
So, was Herod's manic building Freudian overcompensation? Just a case of my column is bigger than yours? According to Professor Richardson,
I think he was really trying to stimulate the economy. So I think he was trying to do great public works in order to keep everybody employed, in order to keep money flowing, in order to move the economy ahead.
He's a pretty smart cookie. I mean, he's playing political role, sucking trade to that area. He's getting everybody building and working.
People have been prevented from seeing some of those other dimensions to his time as king.
Because of his dementia?
Because of the horrible reputation that he had.
So in order to get a holistic view of Herod, we've taken a bit of a look at his family tree, his political world, all important aspects to understanding the mind and mental state of our patient. Now, to get back to the purely physical symptoms, abdominal pains, shortness of breath, and itching. How does Dr. Hirschman determine which is the most important symptom?
There aren't many generalized illnesses that cause itching, and so my assumption was that itching was an important part of the entire illness. Unlike abdominal pain or shortness of breath, for which there are dozens and dozens of possibilities.
The itching may be the most important symptom from a medical point of view, but let's be honest. We really want to know where the worms in the willy came from. Well, this is Hirschman's theory. Itching led to scratching. That introduced bacteria, and that infection led to gangrene, a prime breeding ground for maggots.
I can kind of, yeah, what's that?
Those little white portions are the actual maggots themselves.
They're flies, basically, we're talking about, right?
They're flies.
Baby flies. I just want to stand this straight. You're saying that Herod would have got gangrene in his penis, and then as the tissue died, flies were laying their eggs in his penis.
In the dead area of the skin, dead tissue.
It seems like, you know, divine retribution here. I mean, major, big time.
Now, it's not enough to know how Herod behaved. We need to know the context of how other people got along in Herod's days. After all, we judge our health in comparison to others.
Now, if you would see Herod in the context of history, if you would look at the court of his friend Augustus in Rome, Augustus' mother, Livia, actually killed everybody who would have been a threat or even possibly getting to a position that would make him or her dangerous politically. So she would kill everybody surrounding her.
So compared to Livia, you're saying Herod's a good guy?
These political murders were part of the spirit of the period.
But the Christian Bible, it says he's cruel.
Yep.
The rabbinic literature says it's cruel.
But don't
Josephus Flavius says it's cruel.
that the rabbis admitted that they said that he who didn't see Herod's building didn't see a magnificent building in his lifetime.
Yeah,
and
I mean, does that get you off the hook? You build nice buildings, you can kill your kids?
Look, he was a king of the 1st century BC, and we ought not to forget that. You cannot judge a king of 1st century BC with the standards of the 20th or the 21st century AD. That would be impossible.
Over the centuries, many believed God judged Herod, and the worms were divine retribution. What we do know is that his illness became so bad, he took desperate measures to escape it.
He was given a knife to pare an apple, which he did frequently, and he tried to stab himself, but he was prevented from killing himself by one of his attendants, and was therefore lived a little bit longer.
His subjects couldn't wait for his death, but what they didn't know was that after his death, things would fall apart. Within 60 years, the country disintegrated into civil war. The Romans burned Jerusalem. Herod's reign marked the height of fabled Jerusalem's beauty and fame. But what killed Herod?
Final diagnosis would be that he had chronic kidney disease, and that seemed to be the single disease situation that explained all the other problems that he had. The shortness of breath, the abdominal pain, the itching, all of those could be explained by the chronic kidney disease.
Herod needed dialysis.
Yes, I think that's probably right.
Had he had a dialysis machine, he could have lived to kill again.
It's conceivable, or had a transplant, I suppose, although he was pretty old for that. He was 69 at the time of his death.
Following his death in Jericho, he was buried at Herodium with a funeral ceremony, which was probably one of the most fancy funeral processions that this country ever saw.
If you were anybody who was anybody in the 1st century, you were there.
Soldiers, even from Britain, came to participate in the procession, which started in Jericho and ended up near Bethlehem in Herodium.
Did this bring you closer to Herod? Do you feel like his doctor now?
I feel a great deal of sympathy toward the suffering he endured at the end of his life. I think it's considered just some simple problem like itching, for which there wasn't any good treatment at the time. How terrible a suffering that would have been.
Did you wish you could kind of go back in time and give him some antibiotics?
I wish to go back in time and see him and see if my diagnosis was correct.
Can we say Herod's illness caused at least part of his savagery? I mean, chronic kidney disease is pretty nasty, but does it really explain evil? And anyway, for most of his life, Herod seems to have been a robust, healthy warrior, athlete. The archaeology reveals a great man. The written word tells the story of a monster. Who you want Herod to be really depends on whether you put more faith in the word or the stone.